Women Lawyers on Guard welcomes Dahlia Lithwick to this webcast. To women lawyers, Dahlia needs no introduction, but I'm going to give you one anyway. She is a senior editor at Slate and has been writing their Supreme Court dispatches and jurisprudence columns since 1999. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Washington Post, among other places. And she is host of Amicus, which is Slate's award-winning bi-weekly podcast about the law and the Supreme Court. She's received a myriad of awards for her stellar work, and she's held visiting faculty positions at 3 eminent law schools and has been a guest on numerous TV shows. Dahlia earned her BA in English from Yale University, her JD from Stanford University. So her new book, and the subject of our talk with her today, is Lady Justice, Women, the Law, and the Battle to Save America. It was published by Penguin Press in September. It's already received rave reviews from, among others, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, Anita Hill, and from me. And we are honored to speak with her today. My name is Corey Amron. I'm the president of Women Lawyers on Guard and also a co-founder. It's a national nonprofit network of all genders formed in early 2017. And we're working in 3 areas: women's reproductive rights, sexual harassment, particularly in the legal profession, and gender and workplace equity. So I invite you to visit our website, womenlawyersonguard.org, to see some of our work. So welcome, Dahlia, and let's dive right in.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, we are absolutely thrilled to speak with you today. So Dahlia, this book is, and I see the book is in your background there. It's really hard to categorize, and I'm wondering, I don't know if you can see it here. There it is. Yeah. Oh, great. Is it a Trump era history? Is it a biography? Is it a blueprint to power? What did you set out to write, and did it change along the way?
I mean, that's exactly it. I think the answer is yes to all of the above. You're quite right. I think I set out initially to just commit to memory and to public historic memory what had happened in the Trump years. In that sense, I think it was intended to be a reminder of how much we won in the Trump years, because I think there's a tendency to sort of say those were terrible times and, how awful. But the truth is that Donald Trump statistically lost more than any president in history in terms of court cases. And that's because people brought amazing, creative, thoughtful, powerful lawsuits. So I think it started out that way. And then you're quite right. I think as we were headed into the 2020 election, certainly after January 6th, it became a blueprint for going forward, not just for winning lawsuits going forward. I mean, the book, I know we're going to talk about this, had to be rewritten in the days after Dobbs came down in June. So it became a blueprint for thinking about power and law in the future, but also I think it's not an accident that the last 3 chapters in the book are about voting rights and organizing and democracy itself. So it was no longer just a book about lawsuits and prevailing in court. It was about, particularly in the midst of efforts to set aside voting rights, to do whether it was election subversion or vote suppression or the actual coup attempt on January 6th. It became a meditation on how law and the rule of law is so much bigger than just lawsuits, that you can win all the lawsuits in the world and still lose democracy. And that point, I think it's fair to say it was, so you're quite right. It's a little bit of a hodgepodge or a push me pull you, because it's both a history, but also I think reflections on how that history gets us through the future.
Great. Okay. And I see that throughout the book, as you can imagine. So, and you start the book with the incomparable Pauli Murray, who, of course, was long dead by the dawn of the Trump era. But so why is your book about Trumpism and creeping authoritarianism centered around this unfortunately mostly forgotten mid-century civil rights thinker.
Well, I'm going to ask you how much you learned about Pauli Murray in law school, because I learned zero exactly. So this is an astounding thing. I mean, for people who are listening in and feeling badly that they don't know who Pauli Murray is, like, please be assured neither of us were taught about a figure that I think was as seminal in terms of being an architect of using the 14th Amendment for both gender and race equality as anyone else that we did learn about in law school. And it's an astonishing fact to me that Pauli Murray, who should have law libraries named after her and should have endowed chairs and was almost entirely papered over by constitutional history. And so I think the reason that I mean, the simple, palpable reason is that I saw the documentary like everybody else, My Name is Pauli Murray, by Betsy West and Julie Cohen while I was writing the book. And like most people who saw it, I was just gobsmacked. I watched it 3 times. And I was completely taken with this question of who gets remembered and who gets forgotten, particularly in terms of women's constitutional history, because we poured so much meaning into Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And it's not, I mean, I have the throw pillow look, like it's not as though Ruth Bader Ginsburg didn't change constitutional history, but Ruth Bader Ginsburg was the first person to say, every time I ever interviewed her, I stand on the shoulders of giants. There are so many, not just women, people and allies who were doing this work from whom I benefited. And so I was really struck by that as the way that women do constitutional change. It's not one famous hero. It's usually dozens and dozens of unremembered, unrecognized folks toiling away in the vineyards. And for me, Pauli Murray becomes the avatar of that. I think Pauli Murray, just for folks who don't know the history briefly, refused to move to the back of the bus in Virginia long before Rosa Parks. Pauli Murray was desegregating lunch counters long before desegregating lunch counters was a thing. Pauli Murray wrote the paper, and I should be clear here that Pauli Murray today might want to be referred to as they, as not as she, because Pauli Murray was gender non-conforming before there was language for that. But as the child and grandchild of Black and white families, slave owners and slaves, Pauli Murray couldn't get into University of North Carolina, where her family had been going, her white family had been going for generations because she was Black, and couldn't get into her law schools of choice because she was a woman, and had to go to Howard, where she graduated at the top of her class. But at every turn, Pauli Murray had doors slammed on her. And in law school, Pauli Murray writes a paper that essentially is the outline of what would become the central argument in Brown v. Board that Thurgood Marshall and the Legal Defense Fund at the NAACP prevailed on at the Supreme Court. But you know whose name was on none of those briefs? Pauli Murray. And same, by the way, Ruth Bader Ginsburg relied on Pauli Murray's academic work when she started doing really essential 14th Amendment gender protection work, but at least credited Pauli Murray on the brief, even though Pauli Murray hadn't not worked on the brief. But I think for me, in a book about a bunch of women lawyers, some of whom are not household names, none of whom have mugs and throw pillows, and none of whom have T-shirts and sort of cult followings, that Pauli Murray and the women in the book are much more reflective of how women did constitutional change, which is in the shadows, but changing the world.
Well, you know, the fact that most women lawyers are not recognized at all, right? Law is so male, just highlights the work of your book, really. So thank you for that.
And maybe I'll say one other thing, which is, you will remember as much as I do that all through the Trump years, we kept saying, Bob Mueller's going to save us. You know, Adam Schiff is like, one male lawyer is going to single-handedly do the work of getting us out of this. And with all credit to Bob Mueller and Adam Schiff and Jamie Raskin and the people who really did, I think, form bulwarks against authoritarianism, the fact is there's hundreds and thousands of lawyers who are doing the work. And I think we live in such a like fame celebrity culture, even as lawyers, that we sometimes think if we just pop popcorn and sit back, Bob Mueller will take care of it. And I just don't think that's how democracy happens.
Well, here's the question that, flows in my mind anyway, throughout my reading of your book. And that is, how did the Dobbs decision in June change the way you thought about the book, the work of the people in it, or did it change it at all?
I mean, Dobbs was, well, two things. Maybe I would say this. If you were watching this time last year, then you already knew that the Supreme Court had upheld tacitly SB 8, the Texas vigilante abortion bill in Texas. They did that on the shadow docket at midnight without reasoning. At this point last year, we knew from oral arguments in Dobbs that it looked as though Roe was going to be overturned. And by May, we had a leak. So anybody who was surprised in June of 2022 that Roe was being overturned, I think wasn't fully paying attention, because the breadcrumbs they weren't breadcrumbs, they were like loaf pans. It was so clear what was coming. And yet still, I think a lot of people and a lot of women were really shocked when Dobbs came down, because it was unthinkable that this right to, bodily autonomy and reproductive decision-making that we'd relied on for 50 years had just been stripped away. But I don't think, for me, in terms of the book, I had centered Dobbs as much as I should have. It was like my day job. My day job was watching the end of Roe, but I was writing this book about these women heroes. And then you're quite right. When Dobbs came down, and I had already turned in the manuscript, I had to ask for a couple more days, like to cadge a few more days to really rethink the basic themes of the book in light of what had just happened. And so the very technical answer is I rewrote the introduction, I rewrote the epilogue. There's a chapter about abortion rights at the border that had to be massively revisited through the lens of Dobbs. But also, I think it helped me understand one of the through lines in the book. And I know we're going to talk about this a little bit, this special relationship that I claim that women have with the law. Because I think that for me, Dobbs was very emblematic of what was going to be the urgency of now. And the urgency is that post Dobbs, and you know this as well as I do, there are women in jail in Alabama who won't be released because the state thinks that they are drug abusers and they're endangering their pregnancy. There's a woman incarcerated, Brittany Pula, in Oklahoma, for unlawfully terminating a pregnancy through drug abuse. I mean, women are going to go to jail, and we're going to see, and physicians are going to go to jail because of Dobbs. And I wanted the central theme of the book that I had to really tease out in the days after Dobbs to be this claim that women have muscle memory of all the centuries in which the law was used against us, right? To keep us down, to make sure we were our husband's property, our father's property, to make sure we didn't have credit cards in our own name, to make sure we couldn't inherit, and to put us in jail if we got out of line. And so for me, I think, and this is a bit of a long answer, when Justice Alito in the Dobbs decision cites Sir Matthew Hale, the great jurist for the proposition that abortion was not lawful, people were quick to remind him that Sir Matthew Hale was a witch burner. I mean, he was somebody who quite joyfully endorsed witch trials. And I think one of the ways that the book really sat on my heart in the days around Dobbs was to pull out the fact that women remember, even if it's because they've asked their grandmothers, like, did you have a credit card in your own name? Or did you have to hide your pregnancy? That the Matthew Hales of the world have been around for a very long time. And we have had dignity and equality and freedom for a very short time, and that it can go away. It's fleeting. And that's what Dobbs, I think, very materially reminded me in the book.
Mhm. Well, let's go back to what you were talking about, the special relationship that women have with the law. And you state this throughout the book, that we have a special relationship. Can you just unpack that just a little bit? What does that mean to you?
I think a couple of things. One is, and I want to be very clear because I got some grumpy letters from male readers saying, are you intimating that women are, across the boards better and more skilled and smarter at law than men? And none of that is true. This is not a book that is in any way writing men out of the equation. And I feel like
better. We are much better.
okay, let's just say it. But I think that to say that women have lived this split screen life where they've been both inside and outside of the law for most of their lives, and I have had that experience in my career, and I'm sure you have, where in some ways you reap all the privileges and rewards that men do, but in some ways you don't. And in some ways, particularly if you're trying to craft a career at a law firm or on the bench, you are living in this kind of dual reality of both benefiting from the law, but also understanding there's a long way to go. And that there's some real power in understanding that you're not entitled to all the protections and privileges of the rule of law because it has not been given to you ever. And by the way, people of color, I think, have this also special relationship. It's a way in which I think that duality we were talking about in my last answer, knowing that the law is both the solution and the problem.
Mhm.
And this is where I unerringly cite Homer Simpson, who says that of beer, beer, the cause of and solution to all our problems. I think for women and minorities and people of color in this country, the law has always been both the machinery of oppression and violence and that which can save and lift us up. And I'm not sure that a lot of men live in that duality. I'm not sure that they understand that the law can be weaponized against you in a heartbeat. And if we learned anything in the Trump era, it was that if you were a trans service member or a migrant family or a woman at the border seeking to terminate a pregnancy to which you are lawfully entitled, the law could be used, again, quite literally, to lock you up. And so I wanted to maybe explore that theme. And by the way, I know we could talk about this. Every woman in the book that I interview comes out differently on this question of whether the law is ultimately a machinery of violence and oppression, or, can be a redeeming, equalizing, dignity conferring force. But that tension is very real for women. And particularly, I start the book with crowds at Trump rallies chanting "lock her up" about Hillary Clinton, and how that became, that refrain was then repurposed against Nancy Pelosi. It was repurposed against Christine Blasey Ford and AOC. Every time a powerful woman got into Trump's crosshairs, the crowds would shout "lock her up." And I start the book by saying we thought that was just rhetoric, but the book ends with Dobbs, where "lock her up" is actually catastrophically possible for women. And so I think what I wanted to say is, first and foremost, that if you have that special solicitude for how the law is both dignity affording and also horribly violent, then I think you can navigate through it with a deep sensitivity to that tension. And then I think the other thing that's really important, and I always say, if you're looking at the women in Iran right now who are protesting about head coverings, and they don't have access to the levers of the law, they don't have access to courts, they don't have, elected representatives they can turn to, they're under the complete and total dominion of male clerics, then what you have is your body, right? That's what you have. You put your body on the street. And that's how women got the vote in this country.
That's right.
But I wanted to say we're not that. We have access to our blue books and our yellow pads and to, courtrooms. And so that's a mighty, mighty power. And in addition to putting bodies on the streets, which we may have to do in the coming years around reproductive freedom, I think that we also have this incredibly powerful toolkit of skills that women have honed over the, decades we've been allowed to hone it, and that's not nothing. And so in some sense, this book is a love letter to the fact that the way we used to have to achieve rights, which is get jailed, right, get force fed and starved the way that women had to do, the suffragettes had to do. Now we don't have to do it that way because we can walk into a courtroom like Robbie Kaplan and Karen Dunn and vindicate rights and liberties. And that's a huge achievement. And women are good at it because it doesn't require violence. It doesn't require money. It doesn't require power. It just requires a law degree and a little bit of creativity and fearlessness.
Yeah. I mean, well, and also being above the fray and realizing, what you can and cannot do. I mean, I recall in your book, you say that Becca Heller says that, dramatically opposed positions, fighting it out, in court is just a terrible way to settle matters or arrive at consensus, but she says that's her world and she operates within it. And then you have Anita Hill saying, just pushing one more women into the wood chipper, is not the way to achieve success. And yet she says, we really need to change our processes and our systems. So my question for you is, what do you think we can do when the law stands in the way of fairness and justice and dignity, especially for women? I mean, the whole, lock her up trope. And as you mentioned, we are now in an era where it's okay to lock women up. So I guess I have a number of questions that sort of revolve around that, but maybe the first one is about lawyers. And so do you think that lawyers are trained to play by the rules? So are we not creating as much change as we potentially could because we have maybe a psychological barrier or a fear of repercussion, or a license might be taken away or go to jail? So is this something that is inherent in lawyers, and is this a problem?
I mean, it is absolutely certain that we are one of the most small c conservative professions ever. And I would add to that I think American legal culture is itself, and the law firm culture and the world of sort of big law is itself, I think, populated by people who are already risk averse to begin, right, and then kind of catapulted into a profession where drawing attention to yourself, or picking fights with authority, or doing anything to rock the boat is very much not a part of the culture. So I think that you've exactly identified in your question, one of the drawbacks of the profession as currently constituted is that the Becca Hellers are few and far between, right? And it's probably not an accident. I'm reflecting for the first time that most of the lawyers in the book that I interview are not, at big law firms, or to the extent they are, it's Robbie Kaplan and Karen Dunn who are at the tippity top of big law firms and can do what they want. So I think that's true, that there is overwhelmingly a culture of go along to get along and not do radical things. And obviously the sort of way law is monetized and compensated contributes to that. I think I would also say, and the book starts with, what I call the airport revolution, which was that amazing period when, at the hands of Becca Heller, who founded IRAP, which is a refugee assistance project, in the days after the travel ban, people forget that what Becca and her colleagues did was put out a call for every single lawyer in the country to go to an airport. Because what she had identified, and it was the animating theme of IRAP, was if you have an attorney, your chance of being granted, asylum or refugee status, or any kind of entry visa goes up exponentially. It's not This is not an
Mhm.
immigration problem. It's a lawyer problem, right? That is the animating theory of IRAP. And I think what they did when they discovered, and Becca found out before the rest of us, that Donald Trump was going to sign an executive order that banned people from majority Muslim country, even if they already lawfully had been granted, papers and permission to enter, they were going to find out mid-flight that they could not enter. Some of them had sold all their possessions. Some of them had, been allies in Afghanistan, who had been translators and fixers, who had credible fear of death were they to return. And they were all going to be turned away at the border and sent back to countries where they were in genuine fear for their lives and have their papers seized. And what Becca did and what all those folks did was exactly goes to the heart of your question, which is they simply set up Google Docs and said, just go to LaGuardia and go to JFK and go to Dallas, Fort Worth and go to San Francisco and stand there with a sign that says, I'm a lawyer, and in Pushtu and in Arabic and whatever language. And the lawyers showed up, and these people were amazing. And here, parenthetically, and this goes to your last question, overwhelmingly women. The statistics showed that they were women, and they would have been like trust and estates lawyers and divorce lawyers, and they were not there because they were experts on immigration law. They were there because having a lawyer file a petition for you in that moment when your whole life was at stake changed the world. And so I start the book with that, partly as a call out to the principle you just raised, which is lawyers can do anything. We are amazing, and we don't do it often enough. I mean, that was, for me, so symbolic of what, and I mentioned in the book, because I love it, at San Francisco airport, as the travel ban, news of the travel ban was spreading and protests were happening outside the airports, the crowds were chanting, let the lawyers in, let the lawyers in, which I tear up even now when I think about it, because whoever talks that way, people hate us, right? But the idea that they understood that the point of connection between these, refugee seekers and asylum seekers and this unbelievably cruel, badly written law, the thing that was going to save us was just lawyers coming in with their yellow pads. It's such a profound story, and one that should have been replicated and scaled throughout the Trump era, and one that I think we can still replicate and scale now. But it does involve overcoming, I think you're right, that just deeply ingrained tendency that we have, probably from law school, but maybe from the womb, to be a little bit too risk averse in tough times.
Okay, so those are definitely examples of lawyers acting within the law to overcome and to push back against these issues. And Anita Hill has said, without the law, we will have chaos. But under what circumstances, maybe if you could define them, do you think it appropriate to flout the law? Kind of like the Janes of yesteryear, and even I know there are Janes now as well.
Yeah, this is the question that continues to stymie me on this book tour, because I have been pretty consistently asked. No, it's the question. And I think, of course, it's right to flout the law. And if you think about, as I said, the way women got the vote involved chaining themselves to buildings and being arrested. And as you say, many, many women's lives were saved by abortion providers who were breaking the law. It stymies me because it's been raised in the context of, you may remember, after Dobbs came down, a whole bunch of state actors just said, we're simply not prosecuting women for getting abortions. And, the answer is, of course, that's the right thing. But I think we have to also be mindful that that's precisely, the imperative that allowed Judge Cannon to say, I'm going to make up a fake doctrine to shield the Mar-a-Lago papers. And so I think that, just generally the paradox is, and this goes back to Martin Luther King, the letter from the Birmingham jail, like an unjust law is not the law. And I do think that's true of post Dobbs. I think that laws that are going to prosecute, people for aiding and abetting abortion are not just laws. And so I can sit comfortably with the proposition that just as the Janes did, those laws should be flouted. But I also realize, and I know you live in this tension too, we live in we operate and live in a culture in which the law is paramount, right? I mean, we have to say, and I particularly, I was really struck by the vigilante component of SB 8, the Texas bill that allowed anybody in the country to sue an abortion provider or somebody who aided and abetted an abortion provider, because that's just straight up vigilantism, right? And what scares me more than almost anything about the legal moment we're in now, whether it's Kyle Rittenhouse, whether it is people who take it upon themselves to be election, monitors who sit with guns in Arizona and decide who gets to vote and not, that spirit of vigilantism in the United States has a long and sordid history, right? And the Fugitive Slave Act, and there is too much about American history that empowers the powerful to take the law into their own hands. And all of that, I think, has been ticking up in different sort of areas of the law, the stand your ground laws, the Castle Doctrine, all of that, I think, that says you be the arbiter of what is the law. And so I'm very mindful of that as a cultural moment, even as I say that you are quite right, in my view. If a law is unjust and you feel that you cannot obey it, then you are just in the four corners of the letter from the Birmingham jail. But I don't say it with joy, because I think we as a society have to do better at changing bad laws and not just taking it upon ourselves to violate them. So that was an incredibly ambiguous and lawyerly and ultimately unsatisfying answer to a complicated question.
No, that's helpful. We can talk more later about it. But okay, so one of the things you argue is that unskilled and sloppy lawyering really blunted Trump's anti-democratic impulses. So do you see that the people in the country now that are activating to put us in a better democratic position when the next smarter than Trumper is elected? In other words, okay, so we dodged the bullet there, and it was sloppy, et cetera, et cetera. But now, are we prepared for the smarter Trump?
I don't think so. And I worry about it all the time. I think that if you look at the numbers of times that the Trump lawyers kind of foundered because of the Administrative Procedures Act, right? Because of, simple, dotting I's and crossing T's that lawyers know how to do from the minute they graduate law school, and how many times that was not done, right? That was the problem with the first travel ban. That was the problem with announcing, major policy by way of tweet and then having to defend it, right? So I do worry that President Josh Hawley or Ron DeSantis is going to be, Brian Kemp is going to be able to surround himself with smart, deft, good lawyers and do things in a way that, we all know that it's not that hard to do it right. The real mystery was how much work it took to do it wrong time and time again. And you see this with this shrinking cadre of lawyers that will defend Trump anymore. They're just reckless and careless and sloppy. But at the same time,
and I get paid. All the good ones did get paid, right?
They didn't get paid, and because at some point, like, the stink is too much if you want to have a future doing this. But and it does raise, by the way, questions about why there's been so little bar. Let me say that again. It does raise real questions about why there's been so little disciplinary action against some of the most shockingly unprofessional and lawless.
Rudy being the exception, right?
Right. I mean, it's amazing. Sidney Powell, there are a lot of people who are willing to say anything and do anything and have not faced consequences. And that's bar associations not doing. It goes back to your question about, risk aversion. But I do think that if we tell the story of the 2020 election as a triumphal story of the rule of law, what we miss is that it's a triumphal story of the rule of law only because John Eastman and Jeffrey Clark and the clowns, and Rudy Giuliani, who were doing the legal efforts to overthrow the election, did it in a clownish way. And that if the Supreme Court blesses the independent state legislature doctrine, which the court just heard arguments last week, if it becomes easier to lay down the tracks to have serious, sober lawyers in good suits in courtrooms making the arguments that were fanciful and silly in 2020, then I do worry about the future of democracy. And maybe overlaid over that, to be even more dispiriting, I think that the public is not fully keyed in to how on the precipice we are.
Yes.
In other words, I think all of the triumphal stories after the 2020 election about the system holding were, the system is MacGyvered together with, masking tape and rubber bands. This is not, as electoral systems go, this is not a state-of-the-art democracy at work. This is, arcane, broken voting booths and bad machines and county officials with way too much power and an inability for printers to operate. I mean, democracies shouldn't be at the, and around the world we know that mail-in voting works, and having so I think we've dodged bullets, and at the same time the lesson isn't that the system is holding. The lesson is that you have to push a little harder at the vulnerable spots, and by the way, it's becoming clearer what the vulnerable spots are.
Yes.
And so, unless the Electoral Count Act is fixed, that's going to affect the next election. So I think my answer is a very cautious and lawyerly, we know what needs to be fixed now in a way that we probably didn't. And if we don't fix it, I think it will be vulnerable when the smart Brian Kemps with the smart lawyers go into court to defend it.
Well, I mean, a related question is, so in light of the better than expected election results for the Democrats anyway, in 2022, you call it the great forgetting. I mean, the masses of people forget what happened, yesterday. So do you think that will overcome us? Maybe now we're talking about the electorate. And do you think that people will stop fighting so hard because, we did it, it was good, as you said, it held. And if this happens, what do you think that the legal community as a whole can do to be more effective against these anti-democratic pushes?
I mean, here's where I will say I'm very glad that you and I are taping this conversation after the midterms, because going into the midterms, that was top of mind for me. And I didn't fully believe the polling that intimated that the great forgetting was so acute that women had forgotten Dobbs 2 weeks later. I mean, I was hearing the pundits say, women were upset until July, but then they got over it. And that was not what I was seeing in my reporting. And all of the pundits saying, oh, women cared a lot about Dobbs, but, it's only tertiary to, gas prices and the price of butter. And I just thought that's, again, not what I was seeing. And so I think one of the two things that were proven true in the midterms, one is that if women are activated and engaged as they were, then they can move the world, right? And we saw, outcomes around the country where women showed up voting against their interest, sometimes in electoral races, but on ballot initiatives. Every one of the 5 ballot initiatives that put reproductive choice, including in Kentucky, on the ballot, women voted for it. And so that, first of all, I mean, that's such a vindication of direct democracy, right? That if you're not suppressing the vote, if you're not gerrymandering, if every person gets a vote, abortion's going to keep winning around the country, including in ruby red states. And that was Kansas too this summer. I think that's important. And the other piece of it that I think was really vindicated is that the exit polling seems to suggest that the other thing that people, not just women, really showed up for in the midterms was democracy itself. That an animating anxiety of these elections was election deniers, violence, the vigilantism we talked about. And this election was a rout. If you think about people who were still claiming that the 2020 election was stolen, people who were demanding recounts and trying to decertify. I mean, with the exception really of Arizona, where it's still going on, those people almost entirely lost. And exit poll after exit poll showed that up there with reproductive freedom and women's bodily autonomy, democracy itself was a voting issue, that people did not want democracy to be determined by violence and threats of violence and lies and power. And so I came out of the midterms actually kind of chuffed about both those things, feeling like maybe the great forgetting wasn't as bad as I thought. And that a lot of people who don't sit around their table the way you and I do, worrying about the independent state legislature theory, or worrying about, vote suppression in Georgia and the ways in which you can't bring water to, people standing in line, nevertheless have a deeply intuitive sense that what happened on January 6th was wrong. And here I give huge credit to the commission that was televising their hearings, because I think they made that point in a really salient way for millions of viewers, that this isn't how we decide elections. And so I actually feel much less anxious about the possibility that the Trump era and the violence that followed on January 6th have all been forgotten. I think that somewhere, and it may not be, in any meaningful, like completely comprehensible way, people knew that democracy was on the ballot in the midterms, and they renounced the idea that we're going to do this by way of violence and vigilantism. So I may be wrong, but I'm less anxious than I was.
Yes, I fully agree with you, especially because the pundits kept saying, "Oh, nobody votes for democracy. Nobody even thinks about that when they go to the polling place." And yet, I think you're absolutely correct that that's why we saw what we saw in 2022. Okay, so last question for you is a little closer to home. I loved the vignettes about your son as an insight into the compassion of young men in particular. At Women Lawyers on Guard, we're obviously really interested in the young person communities and their perspectives and how they're working on our core issues. So how do you think that young people, young men, specifically, can help address these threats to women's rights in our democracy?
I love that question. And I should say both my sons are slightly mortified that they peep into this book in different ways. But part of the answer is your prior question about the election, right? Which is, we watched Gen Z talk about standing in line, talk about uncomfortable voting, hours and hours of waiting in limited polling places. And the youngs, boy, did they show up to vote. And I think that's the first piece of evidence that they have really different priorities from, their parents and grandparents. I think that Vanita Gupta, in the chapter, she was the head of the leadership conference when I interviewed her. She's now number 3 at the Justice Department. And she, I think, really gently in her chapter talks about how young people are simultaneously really tricky, because they're very challenging to authority and they have very strong ideas and they're not necessarily willing to sort of stand in line. But at the same time, she says, they are the ones with the energy and the enthusiasm and the vision. And I think that the thing that I am so struck by is that young people, whatever that means, the kids that my son's age, teenagers, are not huge joiners. They don't go to meetings. They don't belong to associations. They don't get their information from like one source. They are, in some sense, the great redeeming chaos, because it means that they're not subject to information bubbles the way we are. They're not subject to groupthink the way they are. We are, I mean, certainly they're susceptible to misinformation, but I have been really struck by, and I noticed this, you know, we lived in Charlottesville when the Nazis and the Klansmen marched in 2017. And I was struck that my son, who was maybe 14 at the time, was getting his news from his friends on social media faster than I was getting it from the New York Times. And he was seeing video of things that were happening an hour before I was seeing it reported, even the Charlottesville Press. And I remember thinking, they are unfiltered and unmediated in their consumption of news, but also very unwilling to trust everything, which has been, I think, one of our problems.
Yes.
And so I really, when I saw the Gen Zs showing up in this election, and I listened to my sons, who, you know, the first 2 weddings they went to were same-sex weddings. By the time I took them to an opposite-sex wedding, they were like, this is weird. I think they are so fundamentally oriented toward justice in the way you and I aspire to. They're really, like, in a deep way, and the polls show this, you know, they're not going to be swayed by anti-gay arguments. They are not, they're deeply passionate about the environment. They're deeply passionate about minimum wage and affordable housing. So in a sense, I think they're a return to a generation that, you know, I think skipped me. They're much less patient with structures and systems, but their sense of social justice is really raw, and also, I think, kind of dead on in a lot of ways. And so my general feeling, again, is that you don't, you know, the pollsters, when they call people on landlines, do not get the Gen Zs. Like, they don't have phones, you know, so they're not being heard, but they're showing up, which is more important. And I really do think, I guess this is my takeaway, and I say this to my sons all the time, they're so sensitive and tender to gender inequality. They really see it, and they understand what Dobbs did in a way that people of my generation do not always see it. And so I just tell them, you know, I think at this point, we're just going to get out of your way and let you do sort of social justice the way the framers intended, which is kind of like bottom up, from the streets, from a complete lack of trust in institutions, but a really clear-eyed orientation to what is just and fair.
Well, it really helps that they have you as a role model.
Oh, thank you.
So Dahlia, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with Women Lawyers on Guard and our audience today. You mentioned Vanita Gupta, and I just wanted to elevate one of her quotes, which was that despair and complacency are the enemies of justice. So I thank you for bringing such inspiring women lawyers to us, especially in this, our time of need, and for reminding us that we have a special power as women lawyers. So here at Women Lawyers on Guard, we think every woman lawyer should have a copy of Lady Justice beside them, just to keep them moving in a positive direction and protecting democracy. So thank you again, Dahlia. We so appreciate it.
Well, thank you for what you are doing. And thank you. I mean, I know this is, as we said at the beginning, often tireless, thankless, you know, not front page of the New York Times work, but I really do think it is the work that, in the end of the day, I really do think it is the work that has gotten us this far, and it is the work that will get us through the hard times to a better place. So thank you.
Great. Take care.